bubblegum and kick ass. And I'm all out of bubblegum.
Another Sunday night here on WESU Middletown. Check us out at 88.1 FM on your FM dial. If you want to do it the computer way, go to www.wesufm.org and you can listen to the show live streaming, or for the next 2 weeks, 14 days that is, you can go to the archives and check it out. We are Pint of Comics. I am Johnny Ganache, and with me forever and always, Sir John. John, what's going on?
Forever and always?
Yeah, it sounds very romantic. Came out a little bit more romantic than I meant.
It was the Carol Channing, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was all that Carol Channing. Yeah, another great episode of the Broadway Radio Hour with Billy Johnstone, even though he was a little rude tonight and didn't transition as well as he normally does. That's okay. We love Billy anyway.
Billy had like 9 guests on tonight.
He did, man. Billy,
he was a busy boy.
Billy doesn't mess around, man. This is the best connected guy at WESU. He always has awesome guests on. If you're even the slightest fan of music theater or Broadway, you need to check it out. Every other, first, third, and fifth?
2 and 4.
Oh, 2 and 4. So two and four, every second and fourth
it's
Sunday.
One or the other.
At 5:30 p.m. here on WESU. But tonight we're not here to talk about Broadway. We're here to talk about.
We are not.
We're here. I'm going to give you a voice noise because I should have downloaded this, but I'm going to give you a voice noise to see if you can figure out kind of what we're talking about tonight. And it's going to be terrible. I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah, it's going to be terrible.
You ready?
No.
What, John? What does that make you think of?
You've got some.
I got something in my throat. Yeah.
Problem. If you're attempting to do a Transformer sound effect,
yeah,
you should have downloaded
okay.
something.
All right. Yeah.
But tonight's guest on the phone with us is Bob Budiansky, who is the man behind most of what we know as the Generation 1 Transformers, as well as having a long and storied history at Marvel Comics.
Yeah, he did
and
a lot.
We're very pleased to have Bob on the phone with us. How you doing, Bob?
I'm doing just fine, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. As I approached you a few weeks back, how entertaining is it to see a character that you basically have developed from the very beginnings on the big screen in his own solo film and being a big hit across the planet? I mean, how exciting is that?
I'm quite amazed that this character that I came up with over a weekend in November 1983, because I was on a very tight deadline and I only had a weekend to do 26 characters, and he was one of them. That all these years later has this really pretty nice movie that's titled that his name is in the title. It's like I would never have expected it way back then.
And we are speaking of Bumblebee.
That's right, Bumblebee.
Yes,
the
Bumblebee.
Autobot.
Yes.
It's amazing how these characters have gone on from basically a simple concept that was a huge toy hit, and then the Transformers comic book line to the cartoon,
yeah,
to the
survived multiple versions over the years.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and a period where there just weren't any Transformers at all out there.
Yeah.
It was just the comic for quite a while.
Yeah, the movies really reignited a lot of the fervor for people.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think a lot of the 80s retro throwback interest, I guess, is what it would be. But how long were you at Marvel at the time that you started developing this stuff?
I started working at Marvel in May of '76. So I was on and off staff for a few years, and by the time Transformers rolled around, no pun intended, I was an editor on staff, and I'd been an editor on staff for less than a year, I believe, at that point.
Really?
Like a full editor. I was an assistant editor before that, et cetera. And this opportunity came up. I was asked to help develop this concept that had come across the Marvel desk. Hasbro brought Transformers to Marvel to develop it into a storyline. And so that was November of '83 when I got pulled into it.
And
so 7 years, short answer. I was there
Yeah.
about 7 years.
And how much information did you have from Hasbro? I mean, other than the Japanese creations that maybe even some of the toys. Did they even give you any of that stuff?
Well, you're kind of stepping on my lines there, Mister.
Oh, okay. No, you go right
yeah,
ahead.
I mean, basically, that's exactly what they gave me. Hasbro, as Transformer historians will know, Hasbro basically got the rights to these Transformer-ish toys. I have a dog who wants to go outside. Excuse me.
Yes.
She's barking, which means she wants to go outside.
And we are a friendly show. So.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want her to bark through the show. It might disturb people. She has a pretty big bark. Well, anyway, yeah. So Hasbro made some deal, which had nothing to do with Marvel,
Right.
with Takara and Bandai toy companies in Japan to basically take what already existed and just rebrand them as Transformers. So initially they had a whole bunch of toys, and they brought them to Marvel, and Marvel, the editor-in-chief at Marvel at the time, Jim Shooter, who brought me into the entire Transformer scene. He said, "Okay, here are these toys. This guy turns into a car, and this guy turns into a plane, et cetera, et cetera. So take them home over the weekend and come up with some names and character profiles for them." And that's pretty much all I had. And plus, by that point, Jim Shooter, again the editor-in-chief of Marvel, had written the initial treatment for Transformers. So there was a backstory explaining Cybertron and Autobots and Decepticons and how they arrived on Earth and so on. So with that backdrop, I was given the initial 26 characters to develop. Now, somebody had already been hired to do that. Jim Shooter had hired a different editor, but he didn't care for what that editor had produced as far as developing them into characters and coming up with names for them. So very little of what that editor produced survives. Notable exception, Optimus Prime. That's not a character name that I came up with. So Optimus Prime, and I think there was one other. I think either Prowl or Hound. It's been a long time, but those two names survived, and I did the other 24. And and I was given basically one weekend, like about one long weekend, right before Thanksgiving of November '83 to do it all. So that was it.
So you also not only get to see your creation, as a movie. You've had a pro NFL football player nicknamed Megatron. I mean,
yeah. Well, by this point things are kind of out of my control. So yeah, people have a. I mean, there's even for those of you who know the Doonesbury comic strip. There's even a comic strip from 30 years or so ago where one of the characters has a dream that Megatron is the president of the United States. I guess the dream may have come true for some people. I don't know, but I had that comic. I cut that comic strip out because Megatron was named it. So a lot of these names have filtered into the public domain in all sorts of various ways. I guess So I guess that means they're good names that people like using them for other things.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. They're solid names. I mean, I'm still a Transformers fan from the comics specifically more than anything else. I mean, I did watch the cartoon. I did go see the movie in the theater and was thrilled. I was also very angry, but that's just because I'm a fan. I'm a fanboy at heart. But I did. I followed the Marvel series all the way to its completion. I was one of those last few guys still reading it when it became the 80th issue in the 4-issue miniseries.
I was going to say, wasn't that the type on it was issue 80 of a 4-issue miniseries?
Yeah,
right?
It was something like that. I was off the book by then, but yeah, I think there's some joke like that put on the cover.
And were you on the title longer than anyone else?
Yeah. I mean, basically, I once we had done the initial development of the Transformers, the game plan was Marvel would put out a 4-issue miniseries. Simultaneously, Hasbro was working with Sunbow Productions to produce an animated series for Saturday morning cartoons, and Marvel was supposed to be the laboratory, coming up with all the concepts and characters and so on, and that would be distributed in all these different media. And so anyway, I was the natural editor to be chosen to edit the 4-issue miniseries since I had already worked on the property. And once the 4-issue miniseries proved to be a big hit, and Marvel realized they had a success on their hands, they continued to publish it. So with issue 5, I went from being editor to being the writer, and I stayed on as writer till issue 55. And except for missing maybe 2 or 3 issues because of deadline problems where we had fill-in writers.
Yeah.
So between issue 5 and 55, I wrote almost all the issues.
That's amazing. That's a good stretch.
That's a pretty long stretch.
I mean, these days you don't get creators on a long run like that. So
I guess I'm a little out of the loop these days. So, but that's my impression too. Yeah, that people get hired for story arcs, and then switch to a different team. Yeah.
I have to ask. I know everyone asks you this, but do you have a particular favorite character?
I guess I've heard that one before. So, I know that certain characters have more status among the fan base because of how they're depicted in the cartoons or the movies and all that. But because I was writing the stories and I wasn't paying attention to all the other stuff, the stories that involved Blaster were some of my favorite stories. So while I was writing the book, Blaster was my favorite character for the short time he was a featured character in a few stories.
I can actually think of a very particular issue where he's on Cybertron. It was one of the best issues, where he's trying to save that one little guy that turns into a rolling wheel, which I can't remember.
Yeah, that's actually my favorite issue that I wrote.
Oh, really?
It's called the Smelting Pool.
Yes,
that was my favorite issue. That one came out really good.
It still stands out in my memory as being one of the strongest issues.
I've got to show I was a huge fan of Transformers as a kid. I read the comic, watched the show, and I'm still a fan, but I'm not as hardcore as you, John. Blaster doesn't ring a bell. Which character was Blaster?
Would you like to take that, Bob?
Oh, now you're testing me. Blaster turned into a tape deck, right?
Yes.
Is that right? So
Yeah.
he was an Autobot that turned into a tape deck, and so he's really what's the word? Archaic or obsolescent or something. I mean, you wouldn't have a tape deck Transformer today.
No, definitely
People
not.
wouldn't even know what it is, right?
I remember Soundwave. I don't remember Blaster.
He was the Autobot version of
Oh,
Soundwave,
okay.
basically.
All right,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, but I forget when he appeared in the cartoon. It was much later, but he was one of the featured characters in the movie.
Oh, okay.
At one point, so.
Now you said before that an editor prior to you had gotten it, and they kind of passed on his take, except for a couple names. You worked on it. You did 24 of the names. Was it 24 home runs, or was there anything that you did that they said these two have to change?
Well, there's a process. So, yes, I submit names, and it has to go, it goes through their account managers, whoever's overseeing the Transformers at that time, to see if they have a problem with the names. But then the real deciding factor, it has to go through their legal department. So Hasbro sends all these names into the legal department, who then do a search to make sure that there are no names of other products that some other companies own of a similar nature, so then they wouldn't be able to get the trademark on that name. So on occasion, I might come up with a name that had that problem. But I would say that in terms of baseball jargon, I hit a lot of home runs.
Yeah.
I hit more home runs than by far than occasionally they'd ask for another name, but most of the names I came up with, they loved. They said, oh yeah, and I'll give you my one anecdote about a very, very well-known name, Megatron. So Megatron was one of those initial 24 that I came up with, and I thought it was the best name I came up with. I just thought it had the right ring to it, and it felt dangerous, and it's the head of the bad guys. And the response from Hasbro was, we want you to change Megatron. The name is too scary. And I said, now, I understood from the beginning, this is their property. They have the right to say whatever they want, change whatever they want, or ask for any changes. But Megatron, I felt like was worth fighting for. So I very, very gingerly pointed out to them, well, he is the head of the bad guys, and he is supposed to be scary. And apparently that was a convincing enough argument so that they changed their minds and they allowed Megatron to stay.
That was a good fight to put
Yeah.
up because
but that you're dealing with people who are used to dealing with properties that appeal to little kids, and Transformers is not the same property as My Little Pony or whatever. It's like, you got to up the game a little bit if you want it to work. And so I was trying to come up with names that had some content, that had some some point of view, not just some wishy-washy names that people would forget the next day.
And they do. They still stand out. I mean, Starscream.
I was going to say, I agree Megatron's great. If I had to pick a favorite, Starscream is such an incredible name for a character.
It's unusual, too. It's unlike many of the other characters that he's part of. So
yeah,
it's
well, Starscream was part of a trio.
Yeah.
So all I was trying to do was Starscream, and I guess people really do like that name. I know he's a very popular character. All I was trying to do with that trio was juxtapose a name that suggested the skies or the heavens with something dangerous or perverse sounding. So I came up with Skywarp, Thundercracker, and Starscream. So if you look at each name, as part of a unit, they all have that same juxtaposition. There's something heavenly about it, star, sky, thunder, and then the other part of it, which is cracker and warp and scream, and they all have a little sound of danger to it. So that's all I was trying to do. I wasn't going for like the home run, they're all home runs, but I wasn't going for like this is going to be the greatest name ever. Just trying to pull together some ideas that gave us connotation of these dangerous jets. That's what they were, jets.
Yeah, Thundercracker. I love Thundercracker as a name. He's also one of my favorite.
Yeah, Skywarp is really good too.
Yeah, and it goes to show you. I mean, once you start writing the comic book and really get fleshing out the character development as you went. I mean, I guess you did all the what do they call that in the back of the figures too?
The bios.
Yes,
the
the
bios,
bios.
Yeah. I wrote those. Yeah. So I would write a longer profile of each character, and then Hasbro asked me to edit it down a little bit so it would fit on the back of the packaging. So I came up with an amended version of it, and so I wrote those too.
And they're. I just remember being as a kid in the stores and looking at the figures and reading the bios, like, oh, this is so cool. These characters are so neat. But I could never get one of the figures. I was too old for them, and my parents wouldn't buy them for me. I did get a few eventually, but usually, mostly in my.
Well, I'll make you feel bad. I had just about all of them.
Yeah.
Oh
okay.
man, I love the Transformers. I had the. So you wrote up until issue 55. You named the first 24. I'm assuming that up to the point of 55, you had introduced newer characters.
Oh yeah,
So
dozens of them.
And did you name those as well, or was that more?
Yeah,
of a
I named it.
collaborative?
A few years ago, somebody asked me. I was appearing at a Transformers convention. And the person running it asked me, "How many did you name?" So I said, "I don't know." So I actually went back, and I luckily kept all my original notes, and so I went back and I told her, I think I named about 250 of them.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So because Transformers was such a huge hit that Hasbro was coming out with new lines of Transformers toys like every few months after they initially hit in 1984. So every few months they would bring me up for a meeting, or they would come down to New York or whatever, and they'd say, okay, here's our new line of characters. And by this point, the toys didn't exist anymore because they had gone through all the pre-existing Japanese toys. So they show me they would show me model sheets, which were diagrammical type drawings of the various Transformers toys and all the different things that they turned into. So this guy turned from a robot into a lizard creature, or this guy turned into a tank, or so. Anyway, from all those model sheets over the years, I was able to continue producing names and bios. So yeah, I kept going till the end, till I finally walked off the book. Yeah.
Yeah. After so many issues of dealing with transforming robots, what was next after that? It was were you still editing or writing?
Well, I was still staff editor, and I want to make it clear, when I'm writing a comic as a staff editor, I'm writing it as a freelancer. I'm not doing it during staff hours, so it's a separate job. So I wanted to move on to some other things that I wanted to develop, and so eventually, soon after I left the Transformers, like a year or two after, I developed a character called Sleepwalker,
Okay.
and Sleepwalker became its own comic book and ran for 33 issues. And so I was very, very happy and kind of proud that I was able to bring a property to Marvel and actually get it published and had some success with it.
And that was a year and a half after. Okay, so I was just trying.
Yeah, about a year and a half, I
Yeah,
think exactly.
Trying to figure out the timeline there after you.
Around 1990, 91. I left the Transformers in early '89, I think, or mid '89, and then by '90 or '91, I was writing the Sleepwalker comic.
Okay.
When you left the Transformers, was it a kind of thing where you were just ready to leave, or was it something where, and you don't have to get into the story of it, but was it something you wanted to do, or something that you didn't want to do so much?
I had wanted to leave the Transformers for like a year or so. No offense to anybody out there who loves the Transformers, but I was burnt out on it. And you kind of touched on the reason earlier. I had to introduce all of these new characters into the comic book, and after a while, I was just burned out. Like, okay, I have all these dozens of characters. I got to push them aside now and introduce this, because I mean, basically, the toy company was using the comic book to promote their new toys, right?
Right.
So to a reader, it might look like, oh, here's another story with some new characters. But to me, it was like, okay, so these new toys are coming out in October, and Hasbro's going to want me to start introducing them into the comic book around that time. So I got to clear out what I'm doing now with these present characters, so I can make some room for these new characters. So it was a challenge, and after a while, I got kind of tired of it because it was just. I would get invested in certain characters, and I really couldn't take them too far because I needed to make room for the other ones.
Right.
Yeah.
So
anyway, I was begging my editor to find another writer, and he was begging me, "No, don't leave. You're the only one who knows this stuff. We like what you're doing, and I don't want to have to find another writer." And so what happened was, by this point, I had met Simon Furman. So anybody out there who knows Transformers history, Simon is very closely associated with Transformers. He's been a long-time writer of Transformers. I'm sure he's written a lot more issues than I ever wrote over the years. And Simon initially got involved with Transformers. Simon's from England, and the British market would reprint our comic books, including Transformers, for the British market. But the British market at that time was weekly, so they would take a Transformers story or any Marvel story, and they would cut it in half. And so you'd have the first half one week and the second half the next week. Well, if you do the math, they're putting out one comic the total of one comic every couple of weeks. Yeah. That still leaves a couple of weeks left over in the month. So eventually, the British market would catch up to the American stories that I was writing, and be short of stories. So Simon was initially hired to do the fill-in stories between the times when the American stories weren't there. So the fill-in Transformer stories were just for the British market, and I had met Simon on a couple of occasions, and I happened to be in England on vacation in February of '89, and Simon and I got together for lunch, and I said, "Simon, you want to take over the book?" And he said, "Really? Yeah." I said, "Yeah, I'm happy to move on, and you can have it." He said, "Okay." So over burgers and beer, as Simon puts it, we made the transfer. Now, just to put this in perspective, I was the writer. It is not my job to find my replacement.
I was thinking that. I was thinking you probably aren't allowed to hire somebody to take over for you as a freelancer.
Right. So when I went back to the States, to the Marvel offices, and I talked to the editor, Don Daly, and I told Don, what happened. I said, "Look, Simon's willing to take this book over. I want to quit." So he agreed, and he also had met Simon in the past, and I guess he was impressed enough with his work. So that's how the transfer occurred. Over burgers and beer at a pub in London.
Was Shooter still editor-in-chief at that time? I'm trying to remember.
No, he was no longer there.
Okay,
no.
Okay. I can't remember half of the things that I remember from Transformers. So,
and another character that you worked with, but here's the thing: we've talked about the fact that you write, but you also have been a penciler too. You worked on Ghost Rider, correct? The Johnny Blaze Ghost Rider.
Yes, I did. Yes.
So how long were you on that book for? I mean, this is obviously all before all of this, but how long did you write? How long did you draw that book for?
Well, that book was kind of interesting. I got hired originally as a cover artist, and that's kind of unusual.
Really?
So I was hired for a couple of years. I did most of the covers, and then maybe around 1981, I was offered to do the entire book, the cover and the interior. So I did that for probably year and a half or a little bit less. But altogether, I was probably on the book for about 3 or 4 years because I was doing the covers.
And who was writing at the time you were drawing?
Initially, it was Roger Stern, and then it was Mark DeMatteis. So it was a good relationship with both. And when Mark DeMatteis came aboard as the writer, we collaborated on plots. So I was also co-plotting the stories with Mark.
Oh, so you
which was great practice because I was known as an artist, not a writer, and so a couple of years later, when I got involved with Transformers, I had some practice putting stories together.
Yeah, it's interesting. You've pretty much done everything there is to do at Marvel. I mean, you've written.
I avoided lettering like the plague.
But you did color though.
I did color. Yeah. I would occasionally color the covers that I worked on. When I initially took over Sleepwalker, when I initially started writing Sleepwalker, I wasn't the artist in Sleepwalker, but I colored the first few issues, I think, and did a couple other coloring jobs here and there. Yeah,
it's interesting. You've had quite the career. At Marvel.
Yeah. Marvel was great. That there were all these opportunities, and if you were available and you had the time and you had the skill, you could take advantage of these opportunities. So I really appreciated that I was in that kind of environment where I could work on my skills and get them up to a point where I can get some work and get it published.
And
so pretty good.
You were in the bullpen itself, or did you do most of your work from home?
Well, the bullpen is kind of I want to clarify what the concept of the bullpen is.
Okay.
There's the real bullpen and then there's the bigger bullpen. Okay, so the bullpen really was our production room, which was like a kind of a sprawling space where a lot of production artists were hunched over their desks doing paste-ups and corrections and things like that. But I think to the world at large, the Marvel bullpen is everybody who worked in the Marvel office. Well, the editors worked in their own individual offices, so I had my own. I was an editor, so I didn't work in the actual bullpen. I worked in my own editorial office. And my last stint at Marvel, I started in '76, but like I said earlier, I quit a couple times early on to do freelance work, including Ghost Rider. But then they would invite me back on for to promote me up the editorial ladder to the next step. So when I came on as a full editor, I stayed for 13 years as a full editor, and went from full editor to special projects editor to executive editor to finally editor-in-chief of the Spider-Man line, and finally out the door.
That's one way to put it.
Exactly.
All right, you're listening to Pint of Comics. We got to go pay some imaginary bills for a couple of minutes, but you're going to want to come back in about 2 and 2, as Chuck Woolery says, because we're talking to Bob Budiansky, basically the dad to the Transformers. Got to name them all, write up their bios and all that good stuff, and we got some more stuff to ask him. So we will be back in a couple of minutes here on the Pint at WESU Middletown.
Tune in.
The airwaves will be anything but dead, as the music of one of rock's most prolific touring acts, the Grateful Dead, are brought to you by Uncle John, featuring live recordings, rare unreleased material, interviews, and much more. Dead Air, Sunday nights at 7:30 p.m., only on WESU Middletown, 88.1 FM.
This is Jerry Ordway, the guy who killed Superman. Whatever you do, don't listen to Pint of Comics.
Sparky the Fire Dog here. Protect your family from fire. Make sure your home has smoke alarms in every bedroom, outside your sleeping areas, and on every level of your home, even your basement. For games and activities, go to sparky.org.
We want to keep you, your family, and your community safer from fire. This message brought to you by the National Fire Protection Association and your local fire department. Visit sparky.org.
Credit card debt, mortgage debt, loan debt. It's overwhelming. Sleep debt is another serious form of personal debt, and it grows when you don't sleep well or long enough. Insufficient sleep can lead to poor health and reduced quality of life. Fortunately, sleep debt is easy to pay off by taking a few simple steps. For information that truck drivers and companies can use to prevent sleep debt, visit www.healthysleepfortruckers.org. A message from CDC.
Hi, doggy. Nice doggy. Here, boy. Come on. Hi, fella. Hey!
Don't run!
Mutt!
Walk away slowly.
He tried to bite me.
Never try to pet an animal you don't know. He may be lost, sick, or scared.
You mean he might be dangerous?
That's right. If we don't know, we leave him alone.
And we don't get bit. Now I know.
And knowing is half the battle.
G.I. Joe!
All right, back with Pint of Comics here, WESU Middletown, WESUFM.org. If you go there and you're streaming or going to the archives, please stop by the little donate button, click on it, and any amount of money you can throw our way will keep us on the air longer and keep the radio station in working equipment. I'm going to say. I'm not going to say good equipment, but working equipment.
Well, everything's mostly working right now.
Yeah, no, everything seems pretty good. We've had a pretty good show so far. John, who do we have on the other side of the phone again?
Bob Budiansky, one of the many, many faces behind Marvel Comics, and the man behind the Generation 1 Transformers. Actually, we should just say Transformers. I don't know why I'm focusing on the G1.
Yeah, really.
Because 250 characters you've named of these Transformers, that's a big deal.
After Generation 1, as people refer to it, I mean, they're the only Transformers I'm familiar with, but after that, whatever happened after that is not relevant to me. So.
Yeah, I understand that. Even during your run, like you were saying, you're introducing so many new characters from the toy lines, and there were a lot of characters.
Oh yeah,
and they came fast and furious because those toys were selling like hotcakes. So,
but before we move on to the next thing, I wanted to ask one question that I didn't get to ask before. We were talking about your output and the fact that you started editing and as an artist and moving to writing. You did all those issues of Transformers as the writer. Did you actually draw any of the issues as well, or no?
I drew about 5 or 6 covers, and I drew most of the last issue. I did layouts, which is a simpler form of drawing. Layouts for most of the last issue I wrote, which was issue 55. So that was, the editor was desperate for an artist, so he asked me to pitch in and do the layouts. And I didn't have a deadline after that, but that was the last issue I was writing. So I guess I did that. And so anyway, I like I said, I did a few covers, and I also did the cover layouts for most of the covers of the books that I wrote. Not all of them, but for a lot of them. So that means I would do a cover sketch, and then would hand it off to the actual artist who actually penciled the cover.
Okay.
I've got a burning question in my head, having read this series many, many times. And when you introduced the Dinobots, there was a 2-issue run with a particular artist. His name is Walter Johnson. I have never found another piece of art by this guy. Is he someone else, or did he just do a couple of issues for the series and then disappear, or what?
Well, I think it's the latter. He did a couple issues and disappeared. He was really talented. Like
yes.
he was one of those finds. At that when you're working at Marvel, you're always hoping to find the next great artist. And I thought, Walter Johnson. I remember he was pretty good, especially for a young guy who just kind of walked in the door. But he could. I think the stress of the deadlines was too much for him. It's tough, especially when you're starting out. It's tough for a lot of artists to draw a book every month, and so. You got to either be able to keep up that schedule, or you got to move on.
Right, and I can imagine after the first 4 issues, which were basically it was the miniseries, and then suddenly it's now an ongoing series. It must have been a big deal too.
Well, it's on one level, it's like any other comic book. Comic books are monthly. Most comics are monthly, so you need to get it. If you want to keep an artist on, you need an artist who can do at least a book a month.
Right.
At least back then, when artists did more than a 6-issue arc, they stayed on for a long time. Not everybody was cut out to do it, so it's a challenge.
I wanted to ask you. You had said before the commercial break, the public service announcement break, you had said that your last thing before, as you put it, out the door at Marvel was you were one of the editors in the Spider-Man group. And when I was doing a little bit of research, you were one of the editors during the time of the Clone Saga, correct?
Yeah, actually, to be specific, what I said was I was the editor-in-chief of the Spider-Man group.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so yes, I get to take all the blame for that.
Well, no, I'll never. You know what? I've never read any of that, so I'll never
Really?
blame anybody. Yeah, I've never read. I was out of comics at that point, and I've always heard. But what I wanted to ask Bob was, what was it like at the time? Were you getting a lot of pushback from people, or was this something that you just heard more in the years later when the story had completed, or was it something like month by month you were realizing that people weren't, I guess, appreciating what was going on in the books at that point?
Well, let me give you the bigger picture. Okay, so back in I think the fall of 1994, Marvel was producing all of these books, and the editor-in-chief at the time, Tom DeFalco, was kind of being pushed aside by the president of the company. And so he decided that what he called Marvolution, we were going to take the job of editor-in-chief and divide it into 5 different fiefdoms, okay? Or fiefdoms, however you pronounce it. So there was the Avengers editor-in-chief, X-Men editor-in-chief, et cetera, and I was promoted to the Spider-Man editor-in-chief. So I walked into this clone storyline, which was already in progress. And so there were certain givens that were going to happen. It hadn't happened yet, but they were happening under my editorship. The writers and the other editors in the Spider-Man department had already kind of figured this out. So one of the givens was that Peter Parker and Mary Jane were going to have a baby. Okay, and so that was one. And then another one was there was a Spider-Man clone, and then to kind of negate the fact that Peter Parker would become a daddy, which would kind of distance himself from his core audience.
Yeah.
He's no longer this young man, free-swinging, web-slinger. He's now, Daddy Spider-Man. So to negate that, we'll find out that he's really the clone. And all these years, it's been the clone that's been posing as Spider-Man, and the real Spider-Man has been, off wandering somewhere. And anyway, so it was kind of like preordained that certain things would happen. I was not thrilled with this idea, but I walked into the middle of it, and I didn't feel. And to be honest, I wasn't like the Spider-Man guru. I was just another editor with certain editorial skills who was given the Spider-Man line of books to oversee. So I was sort of, in fact, one of the architects, one of the writers was Tom DeFalco, the editor-in-chief, or the former editor-in-chief. So, there was a lot of very talented, experienced writers and editors already working on this stuff. So anyway, I walked into it, and I kind of walked into a mess. I should have pulled the plug right away. I should have gone with my gut and said, I don't know about this, kind of pulling this, this bait and switch with our audience, like they think it's one thing and it's really been another guy all along. But anyway, we carried it out. We took it to the logical conclusion, and the audience, our readers hated it. We got tons of negative letters saying, "Oh, I've been reading Spider-Man all these years, and it turns out it wasn't the real Spider-Man." They're very upset with it. So I immediately pulled together my editorial staff and my writers, and I said, "We got to fix this." And so we came up with some ideas. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but we went back and forth and back and forth. We had these very long, painful meetings trying to figure out a good way to fix it. And by the time we came up with an idea that we agreed on, that we thought would work, Marvel was going through all of these severe implosions of editorial staff, which meant people like me and many others were being let go. So it was no longer under my control. I was told by the new editor-in-chief, because Bob Harris, who was the X-Men editor-in-chief, was then promoted over all of us. It was kind of moved back to the old system of one editor-in-chief. Bob said, "Don't do what you're planning on doing on Spider-Man. We're going to hold off on that." And then a few months later, I was let go, as well as many other editors. So there's the Clone Saga from the editorial point of view.
Did you were you there all the way through the Scarlet Spider stuff, or were you gone before that?
I think I was. I mean, I don't remember. I mean, I was there at the beginning of the Scarlet Spider, and I think till the end. But I remember we switched the title, the names of the titles for like a month or two.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
We had a lot of. I mean, we actually had a lot of fun playing around with the different identities of Spider-Man, and And so it was good. I think a lot of it was pretty good, but the conclusion was the problem.
Yeah.
So so I was around for, I think, probably the entire Clone Saga as it was meant to end with the reveal that the two Peter Parkers have been switched. But after that, we were taking steps to kind of rectify the issue, the problems we had created, and I wasn't there long enough to see the end of that.
And how many titles at the time, just for the listeners? I know there were 4 main Spider-Man titles, but there were others as well.
Well, typically, I think in a month we put out 10 or 12 titles under the Spider-Man line.
Yeah.
So I had, a couple of editors, a couple of assistant editors, and associate editors. So we had a staff of several editors, like all the other editorial offices under the other lines that I mentioned, like X-Men and Avengers and so on.
Right.
We had a group of editors and assistant editors, and obviously all the writers and artists that were required. So we put out books like Venom and Spider-Man annuals, and more than you realize. A lot of things fell. Black Cat, I think, was
Oh yeah.
Black Cat might have had a mini series in there or something. There was all sorts. Like we had a publishing objective to meet, so we had to put out a certain number of books and bring in a certain amount of income and so on. And this was a time when Marvel was literally imploding. Like sales were dropping and budgets weren't being made and weren't being met. And actually, the Spider-Man line did meet its budget while I was there. we made the whatever budget goal we were supposed to make, and it didn't really matter. But they were still cutting staff.
I remember that I was a retailer at the time, and the Marvel situation was a pretty big deal with how many things were happening at the same time. Not just to the publishing schedule, but to you, the people that worked at Marvel, and then the ownership of the company. It was a fun time.
Yeah.
If you think a bloodbath is a fun time, correct. Some people get a kick out of that stuff,
Yeah.
So you had,
just being snarky.
you had said before you got let go or left that they told you not to use your solution idea for it. Did they actually end up using your idea, or did you guys have...
No, they came up with... Bob Harris dictated some other idea, I think. I was out of the door by then, so I can't put it together like I was there and witnessing it, but whatever plan that myself and the other editors and writers came up with was never used.
So I was going to ask if
and don't ask me what the plan was.
I wasn't going to ask you what the plan was. I was going to ask you if you recalled like the kind of specifics in your own head of what it was.
No, I mean what I don't remember, and I think eventually, like a year later after I'd left, they came up with some exit strategy, and and it was whatever it was. I don't want to comment because I didn't read it.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. That's cool.
Let's talk about Sleepwalker for a bit here, because that is a character you did create.
Yes.
Did run in the 90s era for, what would you say, 33 issues?
33.
Yeah, 33 issues.
And it is in publication again from Marvel. There's a Sleepwalker title.
Yeah, they just did a miniseries. Yeah.
Yeah. So I remember it being on the shelf, and I remember when I was working for a retailer here in the Central Connecticut area, he was a big fan of that series. He loved it, and I never read it myself at that time. I don't know if you did, John.
I didn't read the original run, and tell me if I'm wrong, but didn't Robert Kirkman write a Sleepwalker title?
Yes.
Yes. I in probably around the time that The Walking Dead first came out, Kirkman was doing.
I think it might have been a little before that.
Okay.
But, I think it was. But when I was so somebody at Marvel, who I still in contact with back then, told me that they were going to relaunch Sleepwalker. And I don't think Robert Kirkman was known for Walking Dead by this point. I think he was still breaking into the business.
Okay.
And anyway, I guess he had an affinity for Sleepwalker. So they were going to put him out in some kind of anthology series with some other characters. And then the anthology series, this is I think in the early 2000s, and then the anthology series, I believe, was canceled. And then Marvel pulled together Sleepwalker and a couple of other stories that I guess had been left over from this anthology series, and they put it together in one book.
Oh.
And so that first issue that Robert Kirkman wrote, and it was already, it was written and it was illustrated and all, that appeared. That got printed, and then that was it. Nothing happened after that.
I'm 90% sure I have it because at the time he was writing Marvel Team Up and then Marvel Zombies, and he moved on to Captain America, and it was right around that time. And I liked. Really? I think maybe Invincible had already started. I liked him as a writer, and I remember reading somewhere on the internet or somewhere that he was the reason he wanted to do it was he grew up a big fan of Sleepwalker.
Yeah, well, that's nice, but it never went anywhere. And somebody showed me the issue, and I read it, and no offense to Robert Kirkman, I wouldn't have handled it the way he did. Well, obviously I didn't, but I wrote my own version of it. But Sleepwalker doesn't appear until the final page of the story, and then there's no more. That's the end of it. It never continued into the next issue. So that was the end of it.
That's strange. We were at a comic store yesterday, and I saw the Sleepwalker title issue, latest issue, I guess, out on the shelf, and I took a flip through it. So there's the character that I remember being on the shelf back in the early 90s, and I see your name as still being listed as creator of the character. So that's at least that's
yeah. Well, I made sure when I heard about it, I contacted someone at Marvel and said, "Do I get a credit?"
Yeah.
Make sure I got my credit. Excuse me, I need a drink of water.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you never read Sleepwalker?
I did not. No. I was more involved. I was more involved in stuff like Speedball and Quasar when I was a kid.
Well, there were a lot of new characters floating around there. It's interesting to see which ones have staying power.
Yeah.
But I'm happy that excuse me that people still find reason to bring Sleepwalker back into the Marvel universe. So it's all good.
Yeah.
Oh, and a little side note. There's a Sleepwalker fan film that's almost complete.
Really?
Live action. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, live action fan film. You can go on Facebook. You'll just type in Sleepwalker. You'll see all sorts of information about it. There's a trailer. There's a poster. I mean, I was flown down to. It was filmed in the Tampa, Florida area. The guy who's behind it flew me down there a couple of years ago. It's taking him a long time to do it, but he's almost done. Excuse me. Flew me down there to do a cameo. I had my Stan Lee moment in the yeah. So you never know.
Yeah, it's true.
Hey, one of the podcasts I listen to, we've had the guys on here, Ghosts of the Stratosphere. They do like read piles where they go through books, and they did Sleepwalker recently. One of the main guys, his version, Bob's version, and the main host there is a huge fan of it. So they kind of talked about it for a while. And now the character, again, not having read it, was the character an alien? Was that what it was?
Yeah, he was an alien from another dimension, from what I call the mindscape. So it was a dimension that linked everybody's consciousness through the dimension of sleep and dreams, mainly dreams. And he gets connected to a college student, here, happens to live in Brooklyn, and through the college student, when his name is Rick. So when Rick falls asleep, Sleepwalker emerges, and he's sort of like he's basically a cop. He's basically somebody patrolling the mindscape to make sure that evil entities don't take over people's minds and do all sorts of nasty things. So he's part of this Sleepwalker police force, basically. But this particular one gets stuck here, and then he winds up having to deal with all sorts of issues, evildoers here on our planet, in our dimension. I created him as the anti-Superman, basically. So
an alien force for good, but a little bit different.
Yeah. So once upon a time, one of our editorial meetings, Jim Shooter, who you may or may not know, wrote Superboy and Legion of Superheroes when he was like 13 years old, and so he had a long history with Superman. So he mentioned at a meeting, he said, if Superman actually existed, people wouldn't be welcoming him with open arms. Nations of the world would be uniting to figure out how to stop him because he'd be such a threat. And side note, interestingly enough, that was kind of the plot to the Man of Steel movie.
Yeah.
I mean, back then everybody just accepted Superman as this, nice guy, hero. Everybody could trust him. But anyway, back to Sleepwalker. So that spurred the idea. That was like some editorial meeting in the mid '80s. I said, yeah, that's a good. Like if Superman didn't happen to look like the all-American hero,
right,
but looked like some bug-eyed alien, how would that work? So that was the germ of the idea for Sleepwalker, that I came up with a anti-Superman, still heroic, but no longer looking like Mr. All-American.
Just remind me, who drew most of the series that you wrote?
Oh, Brett Blevins drew most of the first 17 issues.
Okay.
I think he missed one or two. But Brett Blevins was the first artist, and he was phenomenal. I mean, he was my first choice. I was so thrilled that he was available, and he was willing to do it, and he was great.
I can just picture it in my head too, because he's got a very distinctive art style. So
yeah.
Well, the character's very distinctive looking too.
Well, yeah, that too.
It's a very cool design.
Yeah. Now, I will take the credit for the design, even though Brett was the artist, and he certainly improved on my design. I create, because I do have some art skills. I was able to create the design that I wanted, and have it executed by Brett and other artists.
That must have made your job with the Transformers easier too. Even though you have some, I guess, concept art, you can actually, as you were naming them and coming up with stuff, you could jot things down and kind of draw things out and give yourself a little. I don't know if you did that or not, but it seems like being an artist would definitely be such a help to being a writer as well.
Well, yeah, I didn't go quite as far as, like I said, I did design most of the covers on the books that I wrote, but so I went as far as that. But as far as the interiors, I left that up to the generally the artists who were drawing the interiors. That was their job. I didn't get in their way. The only occasion where something like that happened was I wrote a book. I wrote a story which had Blaster in it, where he had to deal with this alien virus called scraplets. These little mischievous, elfish-looking like combinations of nuts and bolts and evil-looking faces, and so the artist Don Perlin, who was doing a pretty good job on the book overall, but he didn't quite get the concept that these should be like these mischievous little elves, but robotic. So I drew the cover for that.
Okay.
So once he saw the cover with with my concept of what these scraplets look like, then he was able to go back in the book and get the right feel for it, and then that worked out just fine.
I'd forgotten Don Perlin had done some issues.
He did a bunch. Yeah.
He's a great artist.
Yeah.
All right. So before we head out, we're getting close to the end here. You mentioned earlier that you had been kind of out of the game in terms of when we were talking about like newer comics stuff. What have you been up to? What are you doing now? What's going on?
Well, so I left Marvel and I moved on, and I worked as a assistant creative director at Scholastic Publishing, and then nowadays I am the recreation director for the town that I live in, and I do art commissions.
Really?
So I'm pretty much out of corporate comic books for a long time now, but I do commissions based on my comic book work, and I get invited to conventions, comic conventions, Transformers conventions. So I'm still connected in that way, but I'm not really doing anything for specific companies anymore.
I'm sure the Transformers convention years, they love having you around.
Yeah, and generally when I go to a convention, people who know who I am are happy to see me and talk to me and ask the kind of questions you're asking me.
I read that you were
when you were creating Blaster. Why did he have little things on his head?
Yeah, there's got to be those awkward moments, I'm sure.
Oh, God.
They're not awkward for me. I mean, we're very rare. I mean, basically, I'm pretty plain with people. If they ask me something about some little detail that is burned into their memory, it doesn't mean it's burned into my memory. I just say, hey, I don't remember. It's a long time ago. I moved on.
Do you remember who designed the logos for the Autobots and Decepticons?
I think those came from Hasbro. I don't think we had anything to do with it. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Those are very iconic as well. So.
Yeah. I remember the stickers on the toys that were black, and then you would press them with your thumb, and your body heat would make it turn into one or the other. Love that stuff.
Oh,
man.
we're nerds. We're such nerds. But are you making any appearances anytime soon?
The next convention I'll be at is in Lexington, Kentucky in March, like March 22nd or 24th, I think, or something like that. And then I'm going to one in Toronto, a Transformers convention in Toronto, actually a suburb of Toronto, Mississauga. That's July 11th through 13th, I believe. And that's all I have on my schedule at the moment. I just had to back out of one because of conflict with a family event. But that's it for the moment.
And as far as commissions, how can people get in touch with you for that?
Best way to get in touch with me is just like look me up on Facebook and shoot me a message.
Yeah.
So I'll add you to the list. I do commissions, but I do them very slowly, so I have a list.
I was just thinking when John brought up at the beginning of the show, for you to see like the Bumblebee movie, you mentioned like Transformer conventions, like something that you helped to create. They have an entire event based around that. That's got to be a pretty cool feeling too.
Yeah. Excuse me one moment. Yeah. Like all of this is when I first started getting involved in this convention appearances and so on, and then the live action movies came out. I mean, I was as surprised as anybody because I wasn't paying attention to all this Transformer stuff for a decade or two. I moved on, and then all of a sudden around 2006 they announced live action Transformers movies are coming, and then I get invited to these conventions. And initially, when the internet started taking root, and like everybody else, I did like a search for my name, and I found out that there were all of these. Well, maybe not that many, but at the time, but there were these websites that were devoted to Transformers, and people were reviewing books that I had written like 15 or 20 years earlier, and I was getting trashed. And it didn't really matter because I'd written the books 15 or 20 years earlier, and I got paid for them. And there was a lot of fans who picked up the books at the time. But I was like shocked that people cared still about this stuff that I'd written so many years earlier. And then I started doing interviews like this because people thought I lived under a rock and they didn't know what happened to me. And then I started doing some interviews. And all of a sudden, I was again, seeing these websites and these interviews and people commenting on old comics that I'd written. And then all of a sudden, like, people's opinions about me changed. Oh, Bob, he's a nice guy. And, oh, we really love his stories. And because I stuck my head out of the cave I was living in or something. And people now thought I was an okay person. So it's interesting. Like I was done with it in 1989.
Yeah.
So
30 years.
I didn't. Unlike fans, I didn't continue with it. So it was kind of a surprise to me when all this other stuff about Transformers came out. Live action movies, etc.
Well, Bob, It's been awesome talking to you.
Yeah,
We've learned a lot. Just talking to somebody like you is always awesome.
Thank you.
We really appreciate your time, too.
Yeah, really enjoyed it.
No, I've enjoyed it. It's been great.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
Again, if anyone would like a commission from Bob, find him on Facebook.
Just find me on Facebook, send me a text, and I'll get back to you.
Get on the list, because the list is growing.
And
he takes his time.
Yeah, I do.
All right, Bob, thank you so much.
Thanks again.
Oh, you're welcome. Have a good evening, guys.
Have a wonderful night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, so Uncle John is waiting in the wings to come in for Dead Air. And next week, no pint. Next week, Super Bowl.
Super Bowl.
Me
it's
and
our
John are here on
weekend
Christmas. We're here on everything. Super Bowl, we're not going to be here.
Yeah.
So the week after that, we will be back with Scary Larry Dwyer. There's fifth or sixth appearance on the show. Oh, someone's calling in. Look at that.
We'll figure that one out.
We'll figure that one out later. But for now, see ya.
See ya.
We are leaving!